What is up, you guys? I hope you're doing well. I'm Tony Fuentes, and today we're editing the style behind Paola Monaris Franchi, Monaris on Instagram. Now this style is fantastic, so cinematic, so let's go and check it out, guys. So Paola Monaris is the Sony ambassador. She's a specialist in color grading, so she's supported by Lightroom. So let's check out her fantastic style. Now, immediately when we look at her images, we think of movies like Inception, like Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. If you haven't seen these movies, you have to see them. They're just fantastic. Look at the color grading, the cinematography, the framing, everything in those two movies is just fantastic. And if we click on the images, immediately we see this aspect ratio. This is not even a 21:9. This is a more stretched out aspect ratio, so it adds to the dramatism and the cinematic effect. The color grading references Hollywood movies, of course. These photographs are taken with soft light in an overcast day, in the shadows of the big city of New York, so they are fantastic. Another set of photographs in the subway that add to the dramatism. We can see a lot of teal and orange kind of look, which references a lot of cinematic styles from high-end cinema movies. So these images look so high quality that I would think they were shot with a very expensive lens, maybe shot from a movie, screenshots from a movie with a very high-end cinematic camera, a cinema camera. But she just shoots with her Sony a7R III with some Sony prime lenses, so she's a Sony ambassador. So these colors are obtained in color grading in post edition. So let's keep scrolling, and this profile is just fantastic, so cinematic, guys. We can see that she shoots mostly in overcast days within the city, and she's not afraid to cross the blacks in some cases, like in this one. We can see some raised blacks, but very hard contrasty shadows. As we open up these images, the first thing that comes in mind is so many movies. The color grading is so cinematic. We can see all types of movies. These portraits of random people in the city are just unique and very fantastic, guys. So that's the color grading that we want to achieve. Again, what a beautiful portrait, fantastic color grading of Monaris, of Paola. So she also has her website, and we can go check out different styles. In her website, we can see some travel, some film, some work, portraits, everything that she does with different styles of color grading. The one that's more linked towards her Instagram style is her street style, with this category that she's created about reflections. And here we can see some double exposure, some photographs with reflections of some cafes, and this is just fantastic, guys. But the style that we're going to analyze is the urban style that we looked at on her Instagram. So let's jump into Lightroom and edit this style, guys. So these are the images that we want to edit, guys. Most of them are taken with a fast aperture. There are portraits of random people in the streets and some landscapes in the city scene. So we're going to use these two images as a reference. So in this case, we have one that it's outside and it's an overcast day, and we can see that the warmish tones pop up a lot more, but still in the shadows, the blue tinted tone remains. Meanwhile, this other one is in the dark in the subway, and we can see a lot more blues punching in, tending towards the aqua tones. So let's start off with one and create a preset based on that and apply it to several other images. So let's start off with this portrait, and we're going to go to the develop tab. So the first thing that I'm going to do to make this image a lot more cinematic, I'm just going to crop it to a 21:9 aspect ratio. And this is the aspect ratio that most of the movies are filmed in. So we get those black bars on top and the bottom, and that adds to the cinematic effect. So I'm just going to crop it right there, and let's start editing. So white balancing, that includes temperature and tint, plus exposure and contrast. We're not going to touch them. That will depend on each image. So in this case, let's start off with the highlights. The first thing I'm going to do is decrease the highlights to make the image a lot more flat. The shadows, in this case, we're not going to move them. We're just going to leave them. We don't want pure whites or very hefty whites. We want them all the way down to a -100 to make the image a lot more flat. And we're just going to decrease a bit of the blacks to a -14. Next up, clarity and texture. We don't want the image to be a lot more punchy. If we go to extreme, we can see that the image has a lot more punch, and we don't want that. We want something more cinematic and soft. For that, we're going to go with a -11 for clarity, and for texture with a -6. Now, vibrance and saturation, we're going to go to a -15 in vibrance and a -10 in saturation. This will make the image a lot more flat, a lot more sepia toning, just a bit more cinematic, guys. Okay, then we come down to the tone curve. Now in the tone curve, we're going to move two curves in particular. The RGB, which is the general curve, controlling the exposure, the contrast, and everything towards the highlights and the shadows. And then we're going to move the blue tone curve. So let's start off with this one. The first thing I'm going to do is create a point in the shadows and in the highlights right around there. And basically this point in the highlights is just going to act as an anchor, so the upper part of the curve doesn't move. So let's move down a bit of the shadows, ever so slightly. Now we're going to give that fade effect to the blacks by moving this point up. Now we don't want to go to the extreme, otherwise it looks like log footage, and we don't want that. We're just going to move it ever so slightly up basically around there. Now we can see what we've done by clicking this point on and off. And yeah, it's acquiring those colors that we want. Next up, we're going to go to the blue tone curve. And here again, 1 point in the shadows, 1 point in the highlights, and another point just around here, guys. Now, why did I add this last point up here? Basically, it's going to act as an anchor point so the whites aren't affected and don't acquire that bluish tone. So first thing I'm going to do is move the blacks just a little bit up. And as we can see, the blacks and the darkest parts of our image are acquiring that bluish color. Then the shadows are just going to go up as well. Now we're just going to create the point in the middle so the midtones aren't affected. And we're going to move the highlights up just a little bit around there. And as we can see now, it's acquiring that bluish tone that MONARIS is very famous for. So we can see what we've done with tone curves. Now the next thing I'm going to do is just move the colors a bit. Now for hue, we're just going to move the reds up to a 21. The oranges, we're going to go towards a reddish tone to a -7. Meanwhile, the yellows, we're just going to move them a bit to a -14. Now we want the yellows to be a lot more orangey. We don't want them to be greenish, so we're going to go with a -19. And then we're just going to move the blues all the way a bit to the aquas to acquire those tones. Next up, in saturation, we're just going to desaturate everything with these values, with a -21 in the reds, -14 in the orange, and the greens we're going to go with a -11. Yellows, we're not going to touch it, and everything else to around a -16 or a -19. Now in luminance, we're just going to pop up a bit of the warmish tones of the image so they're a bit more light. So for the red, we're going to go with a +12, orange a +21, yellow a +19, and green a +13. Now you can play around with these values, but I suggest something like that. Next up, split toning. And in split toning, we're just going to add a color to the highlights and a color to the shadows. So in this case, I'm going to go with a 35 in the hue for the highlights. And as we can see, it's a very orangey tone. So I'm just going to put it to an 8%. Meanwhile, the shadows, we want a dark bluish tone. So we're going to go with a 248 and add a 25 of saturation. Now we can see that the image is very blue, but don't worry, we're just going to move the balance up to a 50. And then we're going to adjust the temperature to make it more acquainted to this situation in particular. Now, detail sharpening, all those things, all the effects, that's down to you guys, depending on how you shot the image. I'm not going to add any sharpening because, like as I mentioned, movies and cinematic styles don't have an increased sharpness and clarity. Also, images from MONARIS do not include any big grain or anything like that. They're very clean images, but we are going to go all the way down to calibration, camera calibration. I'm going to change the base colors a bit. So let's start off with the reds. We're just going to move the reds up to a 23, and that's affecting the base colors in which the image is composed, the colors that the image is composed of. Meanwhile, the greens, we're just going to move them up to a +13 and a +12 in the saturation. And this is just going to change a bit of the colors to make them a bit more cinematic, guys. And the blues, we're just going to go with a -4 and a +2 on the saturation. Okay. Now the preset is complete. Now the image isn't finished, but the preset is complete. So we're going to save it, just going to go to the right, hit the plus sign on presets, create presets. And up here we type in the name. And then down here we select everything that we want the preset to be composed of. So in this case, I've deselected white balancing, exposure and contrast because that depends on each image, guys. So we're going to create it. And the preset is ready to apply to other images. But first we have to correct this one. So the first thing I'm going to do is ump up a bit of the exposure. And as we ump up the exposure and correctly expose the image, we can see that the blues give away to the warmish tones. So I'm just going to move them up just a little bit to a +90. Then I'm going to move the tint and temperature to adjust the white balancing of the image, to correctly white balance the image. So this is basically the same process that we do in filmmaking. First we color correct the image and white balance it, and then we apply the effect. So I'm just going to add a bit more warmish tones, and I'm just going to decrease with a -5 the tint. And as we can see, the image is looking quite better. Now it does have these warmish tones that we're looking for, but still it remains with the bluish tones in the shadows and in the midtones. Now this image isn't finished. Now we want the subject to pop up a lot more. So in this case, I'm going to zoom in, and with a brush tool, I'm just going to highlight the glasses. Now retouching is a very important part in editing your photos and in cinematography. In all movies, they retouch the images to make the faces of the subjects pop up a lot more. So when you edit your photos, it's always nice to pop up some things, particularly the faces in portraits, so the image pops up a lot more and your view is drawn towards the subject. So in this case, I'm just going to add a radio filter on the subject. So basically, I'm just going to do it a bit rough, guys, because we're short on time. The more time you take doing this, the better results you're going to get. So I'm just going to do it like that. And to correct a bit of the errors, I'm just going to feather it and I'm just going to invert it. Okay, we're not going to move the exposure. I'm just going to move up the highlights and I move up just a bit of the shadows so the subject is more illuminated. Maybe in this case, this part of the image is a lot more purplish. So in this case, I'm just going to move the tint. And as we can see, it's a lot less purple, this part. So hit done. And it's looking pretty good, guys. We can see these blues in the shadows, which is what we're looking for. Now, if we compare it to our reference image, we can see these blue tones have passed into the shadows. Obviously, her images are a lot more sharp. Mine is taken with an APS-C sensor camera. Hers is taken with a full frame with a 61 megapixel count. So her images are going to be a lot more sharp, even with the Instagram compression. But still, the colors is what we're looking for. And the colors in the skin tones, the colors in the shadows, and basically the overall exposure of the images. So I think we've done a good job, guys. Now let's see how the preset applies on different images. Okay, so next up we have this beautiful image of two random people. I was stalking them in the cafe. So let's apply the preset, but first I'm gonna, so you don't have to crop it, guys. It just adds a little bit more cinematic effect, and I want to make a template just like she does with her images on her Instagram. So once I've cropped it, now I'm just going to apply the preset and see how it works on this image. And yeah, this image is quite underexposed. So in this case, what I'm going to do is just move up the temperature ever so slightly. And as we move the exposure up, we can see it gets too overexposed over here. So I'm just going to pull it down just a little bit, move the tint a bit more to the greenish so it's not so purple. And then I'm just going to retouch a bit of the face of the subject so she pops up a lot more. So I'm just going to add with the brush tool just a little bit of exposure, lift up a bit of the shadows and the highlights and hit enter. Now we can see the before and after, and it's looking pretty good, guys. What do you think? Okay, so let's do another one. Okay, so we have this businessman walking out of the subway. So let's apply the preset once again after I crop it. Okay, so let's apply the preset, MONARIS. And now the image is very blue. That's basically because of the tone curve. We don't have to move the tone curve to correct this. We just have to make the image a lot more brighter. If we move the exposure up, we can see that those blue tones start to disappear and give us this cinematic effect. If we move the exposure down, if we underexpose the image, everything turns to blue, guys. So I'm happy with that, guys. So if we look at the reference image, apart from the obvious noise that is included in my photograph because I have a smaller sensor and the ISO is more prominent, we can see that the bluish tones in this image, she's changed them towards the aquas. So how do we do that and create a variation? We're just going to go down all the way down to split toning and move the shadows towards the aquas. Simple as that. Now the bluish tones are aquas. So that's just a variation on the preset. So you can save it as MONARIS 0.2 or MONARIS Aqua, but it's basically the same effect. So let's just do another one. Let's apply the preset and see how it performs in a more daylight situation. Okay, so it's looking very blue and very purplish. That's because I haven't corrected the white balancing and the exposure. So let's expose the image a bit better, apply a bit more contrast in this case, and move the tint towards the greens. So we lose a lot of that purple that I don't like. Then the temperature is going to go up ever so slightly. And I'm quite happy with those results. Maybe I would add a radial mask over her to make her pop just a little bit more. Happy with that. And now, guys, I've gone ahead and in Photoshop created the template. So what do you think, guys? In my case, I think that we nailed the style, or we've come pretty close to her style. So leave me in the comments if you would change anything else. So guys, this is MONARIS. Remember that the preset that we've just created, I've added it to the Edit Like preset pack. Link down below if you want to go check it out. Just a little disclaimer, I'm not claiming any authority on her style. This is just my interpretation on her color grading. So if you want to support her and achieve her perfect like styles, just go and support her buying her presets on her shop. She'd be very thankful. And talking about support, guys, we've reached the 10,000 subscriber mark. I'm very thankful to you guys. Also, this month is my birthday, so to celebrate, we've added a 50% discount to my vintage preset packs. Both of them have a 50% discount at checkout with this code down here. So if you want to support me, if you can support me in any manner, I'd be very thankful. Maybe I can buy myself a birthday present. So if you did like the video, can you please give it a like? It really makes a difference, and consider subscribing. Hit the notification bell to be notified when I upload the next video. I'm Tony Fuentes. Cheers to all of you, and see you in the next one.